Rick and Morty comic issue 1. Now for something completely different. When the comic first starts, it has the smart decision to take place in a different universe from the one the shows Rick and Morty live in, which makes perfect sense since this is an alternate continuity. So, issue 1. Right away I want to say that I love how the art looks exactly like the show, so it really feels like you're watching an episode of the show, minus the sound of course. Occasionally the art doesn't look identical to it, but usually they get that right. So in the first story, we start out with Morty being told by his father that it's about time he get a job, and Morty lampshades that he might be too busy because his grandfather is constantly going on interplanetary adventures with him. Yeah, I'm not going to waste time telling you what the franchise is like. I think the comic will be able to teach you as we go. Other YouTubers would spend like 5 minutes with an intro, and everyone would want to skip it. Jerry says that when he was Morty's age, he worked 2 jobs and went to school. Wow. Rick asks him how that worked out for him. I remember always being impressed at how realistic Rick's dialogue is. They try to balance the fact that he's an impossibly capable engineer genius by having him not only be a flawed person, but also talk with a stutter and randomly burp a lot. Like he's a slob, like you'd never expect a genius to be, rather than everybody always speaking perfectly like a scripted person. And Morty stutters too, so he's definitely his grandson. Anyways, Rick taunts Jerry that having 2 jobs back then wasn't that impressive, as now he's buried in debt, and says that jobs are for idiots. Being productive makes you an idiot? I don't get it. Why did that make him buried in debt? I guess there's no correlation there. I guess Rick's just trying to feel better about the fact that he doesn't have a job, as he plans to show Morty how smart people make money, and tries to leave the kitchen pulling Morty along. It definitely took me a while to get used to the character designs of Rick and Morty in summer. I still don't like them, but the show got me to warm up to the characters themselves. Morty lampshades Rick being mean to Jerry unprovoked, and says that he thinks he hears him crying. Well, the justification is usually that Jerry's an idiot. Confusingly so. He's like the boom knuckles of Rick and Morty. Rick uses a key on a door while too lazy to really justify it, and asks Morty what he knows about the stock market. Normally Rick calls Morty an idiot, but that's usually seemed like an informed flaw to me. And the creators of the show have even said that as an adult, Morty will be about as capable as Rick. And here, he shows that he can at least try to sound like he knows what a stock market is, using big words like equity stake and aggregation. The predictable joke is that this isn't the answer Rick wanted to hear. I guess because it was a predictable answer and made Morty sound smart. So Rick tells him he should have said nothing and hands him a magical device and says that this is all he needs to know about the stock market. He tells Morty that he made a device that can predict the future, so he can play the intergalactic stock market exchange and make a lot of money. Cool. How can he make that in a modern, non-futuristic world? That's one of the most common plot holes in the franchise that you have to ignore for the sake of enjoying it. A necessary part of the premise is that Rick is able to engineer anything, even though realistically he'd be limited by the scientific knowledge of the planet he's on. And yet nearly every Rick of every universe we've seen is a scientific genius. It's necessary for the premise of the show, and the plots that result from it are more than interesting enough to be worth it, so I can accept it. You just have to pretend Rick is a wizard who can magic up whatever he wants, and that would have made more sense. The biggest reason the series is appealing to me is that it's creative and interesting. Morty lampshades that his future predicting device seems too easy and naturally asks if it's legal, and Rick answers evasively that he's aware of how legal it is while pulling the tarp off his spaceship, and says that all Morty has to do is put his name on the forms and he'll handle everything else. And he says slang in an unnecessary failed attempt to sound cool. He doesn't need to do that because he's already pretty cool, if a tragic character. Oh good, it's lampshaded. Morty even says that felt a little forced. So the writer was aware of it and did it to make Rick more flawed. This franchise feels like it has good self-awareness, not just a shallow reference kind of Sonic. Compared to Sonic, this series feels like it's genuinely fantastic, and I'm really not used to that. Morty asks if people are even still saying that slang, and he's only saying it because he thinks he's supposed to. Rick's offended as Morty gets into the spaceship with him, and is petty enough to still be annoyed as the spaceship flies off, and I can't stop smiling. It's constantly amusing how even the smartest man in the universe is petty. Morty tries to make him feel better by acting on board with his get-rich-quick scheme, and and Rick's still annoyed with him, embarrassing him. I guess the reason the spaceship still hasn't escaped Earth's atmosphere in all this time of them talking, even though it has to fly really fast to be serviceable interplanetary travel, is because Rick was distracted by Morty's insult and flew slower. Plus, if he immediately started flying really fast, it'd break their necks from G-force, so they have to gradually build up speed. Rick says it's okay and tells him to stick with him and do what he says, as they've already reached another planet. As if Morty was still worried about what he was earlier in all that time. That's a fast spaceship. Rick tells Morty in between drinking that he's not actually allowed inside the building, and Morty's worried because he doesn't like to break rules. I guess he doesn't trust Morty enough to do this all alone, because he could have just sent Morty inside the building while waiting outside the building. But how would he know what to do? It's an alien planet and a building he's never been in. But yeah, Morty's worried because he doesn't like to break rules. Rick snarks about how lame that can be, saying sarcastically that the girls love that, and Morty makes me smile by actually getting offended, saying, "I do just fine!" instead of letting the insult go over his head for once. He says he likes who he is, and gets interrupted standing up to him when Rick is recognized by a guy who for some reason is fixated on time puns just because he has a clock necklace. Fortunately, it's lampshaded by Rick and some more amusing dialogue. The guy shakes Morty's hand and introduces himself as Professor Talk, a first-class time detective. Wait, what would the other classes do? Why is there more than one? Morty's impressed with him, and Rick gets offended and calls him out on it, and makes fun of Talk's name. Rick is reminded that he's not allowed to be here, and Talk says he might already know why he's here. And Rick snaps at him paranoidly that if he did know, he'd just arrest him already, and he complains that time travel's just paradoxes and doesn't make sense and is garbage science. He's only saying this because the writers of the series are smart enough to hate time travel and plots, and only did it in one episode. Talk lampshades that Rick just gave away that he's doing something arrestable, and walks away, telling Morty to come with him before he loses his temper on Talk, who makes a watch pun while still being taken seriously as he says he'll be watching him. Morty tells him to keep walking despite being annoyed by the clock pun, and lampshades that he didn't seem like such a bad guy. But of course Rick would see him as one because he's enforcing the law and thus would act against them. Rick gets suspicious of him and randomly accuses him of wearing a wire. It's just a meaningless joke for dark comedy, but it's too confusing for me. He immediately backs off and believes Morty, and says that he has to get Morty registered before the place closes for the day. He says that all Morty has to do is pass a simple DNA scan to make sure he's registering in the proper timeline. Wait, why would a DNA scan prove anything? There's an infinite amount of Mortys in other universes. And as a Morty, they'd all have the same DNA as each other. And I don't see what the word quantum has to add or means here. It's magic. Anyways, Rick says that after this, they can do the rest of this from the safety and comfort of their own home. Want to make more sense if the reason they knew he was registering in the proper timeline was that they scanned his memories and matched them with knowledge of a timeline? I think the reason that they're doing this in the alien stock market exchange and not Earth stock market exchange, where Professor Talk would have no reason to see them in, is because all they would make from the Earth stock market is Earth money. And Rick doesn't care about that because Earth is just one small podunk planet in the universe, while other currencies could buy him a lot more stuff. Morty's hesitant about all this, and Rick motivates him by saying that doing this could get Jerry off his back about getting a job. Even though I think Jerry's point was that having a job means you're working hard to earn money. And this won't earn money because it'd be too easy. He says he needs to stand up to his father as Morty isn't on board with it, and Talk looks suspicious of them. Then we cut ahead and see that their house got an expansion added to it saying Morty and Rick Inc. It sure was generous of Rick to let Morty's name be before his. And we see a construction crane and some bang sound effects. Jerry complains that he can't think with all this banging as construction workers walk by in his living room. And his wife Beth asks what he needs to think so hard about, deflecting his complaint when you'd think she'd be just as annoyed with the banging. She asks Jerry why he can't be happy for Morty, and reminds him that he's the one who told Morty to get a job. It's very common of her to defend her father Rick. She is faithful to a fault to him. Jerry complains about the fact that Morty added a $10 million expansion to their house and says he doesn't need 3 bathrooms. I mean, it does make sense that he'd see that as unnecessary, but multiple bathrooms is convenient. There's a lot of people in the house. He says he's gonna set things straight, sees a giant crate, and a robotic person-sized cat breaks out of it saying hello user. So why did it wait this long to break out of the crate if it could do so that easily? How did it know when it was supposed to do it? Jerry screams and cowers and tells it unnecessarily where the children and valuables are, and even the code to the safe. It says thanks and that knowledge will be noted, and Rick even calls him out on this. But he's already so used to him by now that he doesn't have the energy to be angry, and it's just a deadpan snarker about it. He says that was dark, and now he's gonna go back to making another $1 billion or whatever. He doesn't really think things through. He thought he wanted to get rich, and now that he's getting all that money, he doesn't care. Wait a minute. He's making money off the stock market of another planet entirely. So, how is he being paid in Earth money? Those were clearly human construction workers. I guess it's not Earth money, and he's just saying dollars so Jerry can understand. I mean, after all, we did randomly see a cat robot out of nowhere that I guess is a servant for Rick. The other planet can't just create new Earth money to pay Rick. That'd be counterfeit and get caught and cause inflation. But I guess it's such good counterfeit that nobody notices. It'd be impossible for a 14-year-old like Morty to get his name in ink with his grandpa on Earth just because he made good stock market predictions. Jerry hopes Rick will make the stop if he admits that he was wrong and Morty doesn't need a job, and Rick just says he'll think about it with a squinting expression that made me giggle, as he probably doesn't mean it. Jerry looks full of despair, and then Talk shows up and makes a deal with him, since Jerry has a problem with Rick doing this too. Jerry agreeing to this was foreshadowed pretty well, as if he doesn't have loyalty to his kids over himself, it's only natural he'd get Rick in trouble too. Rick casually throws some cup with liquid over his shoulder, and goes into Morty's office where he has a tie, and he tells him that they've got Jerry reeling and it's time for phase 2. But it's clear from Morty not facing him that he's not that interested in being bossed around and has let it get to his head. Rick is smart by saying they should unload all their stocks now while the market is hot. And Morty just snarks at him for saying "we" a lot, asking if he's got a mouse in his pocket. It was also amusing that Rick asked if this is a bit. I like how the series is self-aware enough to have Rick say bit. Rick lampshades that mice don't even say "we," they just squeak, being amusingly petty again as he says this isn't up for debate. Morty says that's not the point. Morty pointlessly says that the only name on those forms is his, while Rick collects the checks. I mean, he's an adult. And he says he doesn't need Rick for this. It seems out of character for him. But when you consider how much his adventures with Rick put him through, the justification that he sees Rick as a jerk and would get rebellious against him is there, but he's still taking a pretty petty excuse since it's obviously Rick who got them the money. Can a 14-year-old just collect a check from a stock market and cash it? Rick even tells him that without his device he'd have nothing. Morty contacts the cat robot Katogami and tells it to escort Rick out of his office. So Rick decides to tell Morty how his device works to spite him. He says that it works by merging their timeline with the future one where the stocks they invested in were successful. So literally every time that he presses a button, he destroys the other timelines. Even though this is dark, as he blames Morty for the resulting deaths of the people in those timelines, I can't stop smiling at the dark comedy here because of the way that he says it. He's so petty that he just casually tells his grandson this and blames him for something that's his fault. And it's hilarious how irresponsible an 80-year-old genius like him is. I mean, it's not really a big deal to me because how do those future timelines actually exist? They're not in the present. They haven't happened yet. So there is no blood on Morty's hands. It's not like he destroyed a universe in the present time. Rick just used his device to manipulate the possibilities that could happen in the future so that only one could happen, nipping the development of other timelines in the bud. It's not really destroying a universe or anything, that universe is simply prevented from coming to exist. Anyways, Rick gives him his device, casually walking away, and says that he hopes he can sleep at night. It's so amusing how he doesn't actually care. Like, that's the kind of line that you'd expect to have actual hatred to it, and he's just casual. Then Rick and Morty panic when Talk threatens them through a megaphone, saying that the Time Police have permission from Jerry to search the premises. Rick panics and says they have to go and start a new life, obviously planning on zone hopping with him as he pulls out a bag and hands it to Morty. They start running, and the robot cat goes into battle mode and smashes through the wall. Rick tells Morty to ignore that, and Morty fortunately says he's sorry he let the money go to his head. I still don't know how that happened. Rick immediately forgives him, putting his arm around him. It's heartwarming moments like this that help make this series great. Rick may be a villain protagonist, but he does care about his family. He's just really apathetic and irresponsible. There are infinite realities with infinite family members after all. Morty lampshades with a cheesy, happy tone that Rick said the same slang he said earlier again in a heartwarming bookends moment. And then as they try to walk down the spiraling stairs, the time cops start running up to them. I have to wonder why the hell Rick didn't just immediately use his portal gun to create a portal and go to another universe with Morty. Instead he tried to walk down the stairs? This is Rick we're talking about. He's constantly ridiculously prepared. Why did he not have his portal gun with him at all times? He could have escaped the situation really easily and avoided the rest of the plot. But that'd be anticlimactic instead of continuing into a story arc. And it'd be lame to start out in a dimension and already they have to leave it for the first story. It would have made more sense that Rick ran out of time and got arrested if we saw him looking at his portal gun screen and trying to scroll through the options to find a universe where Rick and Morty just died, so they could seamlessly take over their lives. With infinite universes, that could have easily taken him long enough. But no, even then, they had no reason not to temporarily go to another universe and look for other universes to move to over there. So I guess he doesn't have his portal gun with him, so this can all make sense. Rick tries to use a ray gun against the time cops as Morty looks scared, and we see a time skip, and an alien reporter mentions that Rick had a 12-hour standoff with the time police, where presumably he was unable to reach his portal gun all that time. And since the reporter was an alien, and the crowd is a bunch of aliens too, maybe Rick really did get nothing but alien money. It's amusingly petty of Rick that when asked to comment on his innocence on the news, all he said was, "I bet Jerry feels like a real jerk right now," in a petty attempt to get back at him. And somehow Jerry could not be reached for comment, even though the reporter's right at Rick's house. I guess Beth didn't let her. It's amusing how mortified Morty looks at being caught, and how unprofessionally vulgar and mean-spirited his news descriptor was. I guess he just assumed that. Then the alien news goes on to show us a weird-looking so-called space kitten went to a zoo, and it's called terminally ill and having one last hurrah as it sits on top of a sea creature. It takes me out of it how the alien's dialogue is. He's saying our space equivalent of a kitten or whatever went to our space equivalent of the zoo, I guess. He wouldn't say that, he'd just say kitten and zoo. This is more like he's a human trying to badly pretend he's an alien. More realistically, he'd say an alien language word for kitten and zoo. That's the other unrealistic plot hole you have to ignore in the foundation of this series. Somehow, most of the aliens all speak English, even though Earth is considered an obscure podunk planet, where even the Galactic Federation gets stuff totally wrong about it when reporting on it. It's just there for the sake of convenience that all the aliens can speak English, but it's a bit embarrassing when even the Sonic franchise had this make more sense. In RG Sonic got a universal translator machine fused with his brain to explain why he could understand and communicate with every alien he met. There's no mention of such a machine in this series, even though it'd be child's play for Rick to invent. And we even learn that there are alien languages, and an alien holds a translator up to him in Rick's basement one time. So that makes it even more confusing, because it's not like in Sonic the comic, where there's never any mention of alien languages, which implies there just are none. We just have to accept that the creator of the multiverse wrote into fate that English would be the dominant language everywhere, just so he could be lazy and not think up too many languages. It's the biggest coincidence ever that every planet has English and everyone speaks it. And for a normally self-aware, smartly written show, it's weird that they don't explain that. Anyways, the news goes on to show us an informal sports reporter, as we continue the amusing trend where the alien news is way more informal and improvised. He shows off an alien sport that's underwater and involves a baseball bat and a basketball hoop, and a football is being thrown around. Somehow just fine underwater, where the water would slow down. Again, it takes me out of it that the alien's trying to compare the sport to baseball and basketball, and says that he's not really sure if it's played underwater, when he just said it was one of his people's sports. Well, it's amusing how unprofessional and sudden it is that the scrolling text writer below him says he went back to drinking and insults his dad. I guess this isn't the first time Rick's made a timeline erasing device like this, because even though all Rick and Morty seemed to be doing was making bets in the stock market like everyone else, Professor Talk immediately suspected him of doing timeline shenanigans and investigated, like he already had experience with him before, and Rick said this was his third strike. Even though it seemed like he had this as an idea for the first time ever when he pitched it to Morty, Morty thinks that's a new idea. How did he ever get caught the first time, let alone a second time? How'd Talk know to investigate before he knew Rick would mess with time? I guess because after so much success with the stock market, it got suspicious and he checked just in case. I have to ask why they give people more than one strike if they care that much about this. It's not really a big deal to me. We're not being shown the impact of what Rick's magical device did from the perspective of someone in one of the doomed timelines. We don't see them disappearing and everyone around them disappearing as it gets merged with the reality of another timeline, which from the perspective of the people there would kill them. But there's infinite versions of everybody, not just across the universes, but even across all the different possible timelines. So that's probably why Rick doesn't think it matters, as there's not much of a loss in the grand scheme of the universe. So because we're not shown the full impact of what he did wrong, and he's one of the protagonists, I can't help but root for Rick and Morty here, especially Morty, who is just dragged into all this. It's kind of relatable, Rick's selfishness and irresponsibility, because that's a very common thing with people. It is more realistic that if there could be someone who could make literally any device, that person would use it selfishly and be corrupt. Maybe that's just me, but it's pretty easy to put yourself in their shoes when they have a future-seeing device that could be an obvious cheat code guaranteeing success in the stock market. It's more realistic and believable that instead of it working by literally seeing the future, since the future is yet to exist, so what's there to see, it's more like it anticipates all possibilities and wipes out most of them. How it does that is not explained. There's no chaos energy in this universe, and it'd be impossible to explain any of its tech, so it's magic. It was also pretty gutsy of the comic to make its first ever story end on a cliffhanger and continue on to a story arc with high stakes, when the show is usually episodic. It makes sense a comic would be more about continuity. Already that's more gutsy than the Sonic X comic. It's nice to be reviewing a series I'm actually happy with. I postponed writing this review for a few days because I was worried that reviewing the comic would make me start to hate it from seeing more problems in it. But no, I'm still smiling most of the time. And I don't remember any major problem with the story, beyond the really bad luck that Rick didn't have his portal gun with him to escape the time cops immediately, and the plot holes mandatory for the series. But compared to Sonic, this is definitely a franchise I respect, rather than one I'm exhausted with because it's made so many huge mistakes.